So hi everyone, I'm Maddie Armstrong. Just to remind everyone, if you're new to the session, I'm the Skype Scientist intern. And today we have Dr. Liz Burmester.
That's right.
And we're going to be talking about restoring reefs and how basically how stress impacts reef organisms kind of from a broad range of areas. So thank you, Liz, for coming.
Yeah, it's really great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, and again, just Erin's doing our ASL translating, so thank you again, Erin. And then, yeah, Liz, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little background about yourself, like how did you come to study reefs and corals?
Sure. Yeah. So I have just throughout my life always been a person who is really interested in nature. My mom used to joke around, and we didn't live very close to a lot of nature, but she would joke around that I would have rocks in my pockets, every time she did the laundry and things like that. So I was always just very interested in wildlife and nature, and particularly in the ocean. So when I was in college, I went through a lot of different thought processes. I was really interested in animals, so I thought for a little bit about becoming a vet. When you're interested in biology, a lot of people direct you toward just being a doctor or a vet are sort of the two main lines of thinking that people are like, oh, why don't you try those things out? So I volunteered at a hospital. I worked at a kennel that was associated with a vet. And just from working there and trying things out, I kind of realized that those weren't the paths for me. And then when I was in college, I had the opportunity first to do some independent research with one of the professors on campus. And that was looking at how mussels, like these mussels, not these mussels, how they work with different types of stress, particularly because they live in what we call intertidal zones. So these are areas where aquatic organisms are exposed either to air, right, when tide is very low, or when they're fully exposed and underwater when the tide is high. So they undergo a lot of different stress. So I was looking at how changes in temperature might affect their ability to basically live. And also while I was there, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Turks and Caicos. And it was there that I really saw the importance of reef ecosystems, because they are these really huge building blocks for all different types of biodiversity, of sort of all of the life in the ocean that we know. At some point, the majority of it has spent some time or interacted in some way with one of these reef environments. And I kind of saw firsthand, one, that I loved research, right? I was able to do that research, and it really spoke to me in a way that being a vet or being a doctor did not speak to me. And also, I really saw a need for people to do work on those types of ecosystems. So yeah, so then I sort of found my way into different types of reefs from there. I went to graduate school. I worked on coral health for my PhD. And then after my PhD, I worked at a nonprofit in New York City called the Billion Oyster Project. And the goal of this program is to use education initiatives in the New York City area to restore oysters to New York Harbor, which, if you think about coral reefs, oyster reefs were that type of ecosystem for the New York Harbor and similar temperate areas around it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I agree that a lot of times growing up, not like a lot of people do want to be doctors, but I think usually when you think of science, people will say, oh, doctor or teacher. And there's a lot of different careers you can pursue that you can still like science for. So I think that's
definitely.
Awesome. Yeah. And I work with marine organisms too. So it's really cool to meet more people that do research about marine organisms around the world. So we are getting some questions already. A lot of people are talking about how they want to be marine biologists, which is awesome. So someone says, if coral reefs get hurt, can they re-heal themselves? And they're wondering because they just got their I think it's pronounced PADI. I'm not certified to scuba dive. Their PADI open water certification, and they're also curious how people who dive close to the reefs don't harm them.
So this is actually a really great question for me, because my whole PhD was on the ability of corals to heal from wounds. So I can answer pretty much most questions that you might have about this. So they are capable of re-healing themselves. If you think about a coral, I like to think about it as like conjoined twin anemones. So you have all of these polyps, And those polyps are interconnected with each other with this thin layer of tissue. And then from that tissue, they're building this rock underneath it. So a lot of times when we pick up corals on the beach, in fact, here at my desk, I have some, right? Pull some of these guys out. So we pick up corals on the reef, we get these rocks, right? And this is what the corals are capable of building. And if you look at these sort of holes here, this is where all those individual polyps will live. And then this area in between them is where that connective tissue will be. So they have this really interesting lifestyle because they are all genetically identical to each other. They're all interconnected, but they are also sort of one organism that is many organisms together within this one creature that can create this rock-like structure. So when they get wounded, they are capable of regenerating themselves. So it means that if they lose, one of these polyps, they, under the right circumstances, are going to be able to fill in that tissue and regrow that polyp from there. And that's really great, and that's what happens when the corals are healthy. However, when conditions are really stressful, which tends to be the case in coral reefs right now, these organisms live very close to their stress limits right now. And when that happens, they may not be able to actually fill in that space. So instead of having this whole colony here, they might lose all of the tissue that's on this part of it. And what happens there is that there's a ton of other organisms that love to settle on this type of rock in a coral reef. So these are things like algae or sponges or other types of invertebrates. And when they do that, they actually start competing with the coral itself. And this also creates an additional stress for the coral. One, because it's lost a lot of landscape there, right? But then also two, because now it has a competitor directly interacting with it, potentially even trying to kill it to take over more space. So the question about diving and how to keep reefs safe when diving, this is why oftentimes during your PADI certification or other diving certifications, they really emphasize being really cautious around reefs, because again, if you think about it, it's really just a very thin layer of tissue that's sitting over there. So something just like a fin or a person's hand or a fish biting it, that's capable of pulling off quite a bit of the thin tissue layer that's there. So the way that you keep from hurting the corals is by keeping a little bit of distance. And if you know about diving, you know that buoyancy is really important. So that's your ability to sort of keep yourself stable and in the water. So if you're around a coral, you don't want to be kicking wildly at it. You want to be really calm and sort of floating above it, and know yourself, right? If you're seeing a reef for the first time and you're really excited, maybe give yourself a little bit of distance. If you're not a great swimmer, if you're not great with your buoyancy yet, maybe give yourself a little bit of distance.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I think it sounds really cool. One of our attendees had just got all their certifications, so it sounds like they might get to go dive for maybe the first time. And someone also asked, do you know the type of courses, like the type of PADI courses you have to take to be able to do research on coral reefs? Is it a lot?
I'm not sure if they mean in particular if there are courses through PADI that you interact with coral reefs. There are courses pretty much so PADI is just one of several organizations that you can get dive certified through. And oftentimes in those certifications, they have courses that are about nature, about marine life. And a lot of those are, they start off very general, but then they get very specified about the area that you're in. So if you, really want to do some coral stuff, if you're not, in Florida in the United States or in another country where there are a ton of coral reefs, you might need to go visit that place in order to do the direct work. There are a couple of citizen science programs that I know of if you're in one of these areas. So one looks at coral health. So basically you go around with a card and it can tell you whether or not corals are bleached or not. Which is sort of a phenomenon where the corals get really stressed out and they lose this algae that lives inside of them that provides most of their energy. And because they're sort of losing them and expelling them, they start to turn white. And another one is a lot of places do great fish counts, or different types of fish counts. So you don't necessarily need to be on a coral reef. You could go into whatever local environment that you have, and you can do some surveying there. That would be really helpful to a lot of aquariums and other research programs.
Very cool. And we do have some questions about, so you just mentioned bleaching, and we have some questions about how do corals get their color, and kind of like, what is this polyp that you were talking about? What's a polyp made out of?
Yeah, that's another great question. Corals in general are cnidarians. This means that they are related to animals like jellyfish, anemones, these fun things called corallimorphs. And so they have this really cool tissue structure where if you think about people, right, when we eat food, it kind of goes through our bodies. We don't interact with it again on the outside once we're eating food. But for corals and anemones and things like that, they have 2 tissue layers instead of the 3 that we have. So when they're eating food, they're actually taking it into their bodies. So they have this inner sort of tissue that interacts directly with the environment, and then they're releasing it back out from the same mouth. And then they have an outer layer of tissue. And then they have this fun, that gooey stuff that's in jellyfish that makes them the jellyfish. It's called mesoglia. And it's this fun little jelly layer that's in the middle. And because of this, they have what we call a hydrostatic skeleton, which means that they actively use water in order to maintain their structure. So if you were to watch a coral eating, for instance, it's going to put its tentacles out and it's going to feed. And then once it takes in the food, it's going to kind of close up for a little bit, and it's going to get really plump. And that's because it's holding water in its body. And that's how it's able to interact with its environment in that way. And I think the second question in there was about the color. Yeah. And so the color comes directly from the algal, what we call symbionts, which are basically life partners that are inside of the corals. So these algal symbionts provide up to 95% of the coral's energy. And basically they do what plants can do. They just sit in there, they photosynthesize, and the coral takes the energy. And it provides a nice stable home for those symbionts. And depending on the color of the chloroplasts, or the like cells that do the photosynthesis in the algae, and depending on like proteins that are made inside of the coral, they can appear to be different colors. The bleaching comes into play because as there are more and more and more of these symbiont cells in the tissue, which is clear, you're going to have more and more and more of pronounced color. But when you start losing them, or you have none of them, they're going to appear white. And that's because if you look at the skeletons are white. And the tissue itself is clear of the actual coral.
That's really cool. I actually didn't, that's really awesome. And we had some questions about like the range of colors maybe that corals can be. Because I think when I think of corals, I usually think of like orange or kind of like the reddish color. So like,
it really depends on where you are. Sorry to cut you off.
No, you're good.
It really depends on where you are and what type of coral it is. So a lot of people don't know that there are 2 different main types of corals. We call them hard corals and soft corals. And that's basically depending on what their skeleton is made of. So hard coral, or stony coral, is like these guys, right? They actually build rocks that are made of calcium carbonate. So if you think about just a shell, right, in general, or if you've ever seen limestone, that's what calcium carbonate is. The soft corals usually use like a protein, like something that's in your nails, for instance, in order to make their skeletons. So a lot of people think of like red corals or pink or black corals because that's the kind of jewelry they may have seen. And those are all soft corals actually, and they get their color from the proteins that they use to build their skeleton. The stony corals, they're all producing this sort of whitish calcium carbonate. You may see some purple on there on the actual rock itself, and that's actually from different algae and different organisms that settle into and live in the actual skeleton. But the polyps themselves can have a range of colors, and that also depends on where you are. So they can be yellow to brown, they can be green, they can be orange or pink. There's some like blue as well. So it really depends on where you are.
Cool. And we had some earlier questions about like the type of fish that live in coral reefs, and have you ever studied anything with sharks specifically tiger sharks is someone's question.
So I have not done any specific shark studies, but they are an important component of a reef ecosystem. So when we think about fish on a coral reef, this kind of hints back to what I was saying about a large majority of organisms in the ocean having interacted with a reef in some way. This pertains a lot to fish. And I think the stat is something like 70% of ocean fish at some point interact with the coral reef. And this can be because they are a top predator, like a shark, who can cruise around the entire ocean and then come to a coral reef, and it's like a buffet dinner for them there. Or it can be organisms that are really, really specialized to live on a coral reef. And so they can live sort of cryptically or sort of secretly inside of the actual coral skeletons themselves. Or there's a fun type of fish called a damselfish that actually make gardens. So they'll clean off parts of the skeleton, and then they'll let a small amount of algae grow on there. And then they'll keep sort of mowing it with their teeth to keep it at a good length. And when they do that, a bunch of small invertebrates will come live there, and then they can also feed on the algae themselves. And they'll actually sort of violently defend that territory, even from a diver. So if you can think about a fish around this big, kind of coming at you, telling you to get away from its territory. So there's a wide variety of fish that live on a coral reef. And they're all important to be there because they fill a variety of what we call functional groups, where they provide a different type of service on the reef. So you have things like herbivores, right, that are eating all the algae and making sure that the corals don't get overrun by any of the algae that might be competing with them. Then you also have things like damselfish that are actively creating gardens. You have mid-level fish that are going to feed on some of those smaller fish. Then you're going to have top predators as well. And this huge trophic chain that's going to go from the corals themselves all the way up and then feeding back down onto the corals. So great diversity of life lives on a coral reef, and they're all very interconnected and interdependent with each other.
Yeah, I think we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm managing the question box, so you don't have to worry about that. But I think, yeah, we were getting questions about what are one of the healthiest coral systems that you may have encountered? Because it sounds like you've been able to dive a lot in a lot of different areas.
So in terms of healthiest, I've done a lot of work in Belize, and there are some localized reefs there that are really quite healthy. The Caribbean itself, there's less diversity in general in the Caribbean than there is, say, in the Indo-Pacific. The greatest diversity on coral reefs actually is in what we call the Coral Triangle, which is around Indonesia. So if you just have a bucket list item of seeing the most diverse reefs, and you have, if you're not already in Indonesia, you have some good money in your hands, that might be the place that I would suggest to go. But yeah, the healthy reefs depends on a number of things. It depends on regulations within the local government of the country you're talking about. It depends on the population around there, sort of what they're doing with it. It depends on the temperature. It depends on the diversity of fish, for instance. So if you have somewhere where shark finning, for instance, is permitted, next to somewhere where shark finning is not permitted, you might see a slightly healthier reef in the place where shark finning is not permitted. But you also might see a decline in that reef as well, because maybe there is a decline in sharks that aren't reaching that reef. So I would say in the Caribbean, some places in Belize that I've been, but if you're looking for like the hot spot of where the most different types of things are, I would say Indonesia.
Gotcha.
Which is also on my bucket list. I've not yet been there.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, I think it sounds really cool to be able to get dive certified. And as long as you're staying a good distance, it sounds like you can see a lot of really beautiful animals. Someone mentioned being able to see a lot of really cool eels and fish while they were diving. So, and it does sound too that if we can preserve the diversity of the animals that live in these coral reefs, we can save the corals themselves, right?
Yeah, so there's two different thoughts there. Kind of speaking back to those trophic levels I was talking about, and I personally think that they strongly interact with each other. So some people think it's really important to work from the top down and to focus from there and make sure that you have all of the different components of the ecosystem that are needed in order to maintain the coral reef. But then you also have bottom up, which means that you're going to be protecting the coral reef from the coral itself, right? And moving its way up. What's happening right now is that we're having this sort of rapid decline on both layers at the same time. And you can't really preserve the entire ecosystem that depends on a coral reef without corals physically being there. So a lot of the restoration work that goes into coral reefs is actually in gardening corals that have been in decline, that maybe were the keystone species or the real major reef builders of the area, in order to build up that coral population so that you can then, make sure all those components have somewhere to live on. But it's also really important in reef environments to make sure that you have those levels as well. So if we are actively hunting sharks, for instance, then that can have impacts on everything leading down as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's hard, because if you can't pinpoint exactly what's happening, it's hard to know what solution to take. But it sounds like, yeah, maybe tackling it from both sides might be the best way to go. We do have a question about in naturally stressful times, so non-human stressed times, how long do corals, like maybe the average coral species, lives, and how much of that is kind of changing with climate change? Like, what can you say about that?
So corals can live, I don't have an exact number for like their average lifespan, and I think that would definitely depend on their species as well, but they can live hundreds of years. So in places where you have really healthy reefs, like in maybe remote islands in the Pacific where culturally people really care about their ocean environment and there aren't a ton of population, then you might see a lot of these like older boulders of coral that, I've seen pictures of colleagues that are swimming next to them and maybe they're like this big and the coral around them is like larger than them and bigger than them. And those will be hundreds of years old. And so it's hard to necessarily say an individual coral how long it might live for. Climate change is definitely a major impact on the longevity and the health of corals. So like I said, corals live very, very close to their stress limits, and a really common one is their thermal limit or their temperature limit. So they might be within like 1 degree Celsius of where they're going to start bleaching, and then because they're losing 95% of their energy, they're going to start starving to death. And so they're going to start losing tissue, and then they're going to have other organisms growing on the coral competing with them. And this is how we get a loss of live coral cover. And then once you have that loss of live coral cover, you start to head into what we call a phase shift, where you're moving from one type of environment to another type of environment, where you need an incredible amount of energy and input trying to push it back into the environment it was before. So if you have this really great ecosystem covered in live corals, then those corals are going to continue to deposit calcium carbonate, continue to make rocks, right? Continue to make this really complex structure that all of these fish and different organisms can live in. Whereas if all the live tissue starts dying, then suddenly you don't have anyone making that substrate anymore. And now you have algae and sponge and all these other organisms that naturally live on the reef, but in smaller densities. Their function is to make a habitat out of these rocks. And part of that means that because no one's actively building it anymore, it means it's going to start to degrade away. And so you're going to lose that complex substrate. And that's why you see a lot of decline of different types of fishes and the diversity of reef habitats when there aren't live corals there anymore.
And that's crazy. And we have a couple, just a reiteration about, so corals are animals, even though they kind of look like plants, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we do have a question about, so like kind of, I guess, about how polyps work, like how this coral breaks, but then how are the breaks surviving?
That's a great question. So first, the corals are animals. They're sort of animal, plant, and mineral all in one, right? Because they make rocks, they have these algae that live in them, and they're also animals. And in fact, their like group name, their taxonomic grouping name is anthozoan, which means flower animals. So when people were sort of categorizing things, like they were like, there's this weird flower animals. There are animals that are flowers, which is kind of true actually when you think about them. Because they both in the polyp structure kind of look like a flower, but they also in many ways act like a plant, even though they're an animal. And the second question was, sorry, do you mind reminding me really quick?
No, you're good. I always try to combine questions, and sometimes it's a little more difficult. It was just about like, how can those breaks, like, so if corals break really easily, how do those pieces that break off survive?
Yeah, another great question. So the first part of it is that each of these individual polyps, right, where there would be a polyp there kind of hanging out, they can act as an individual animal because they are an individual animal by themselves. But because they're connected through this tissue and they're able to share things like nutrients and things like that through the tissue, they're able to act together as a colony. And we're not really programmed as humans to think this way because, you know, we think of ourselves as this individual unit. We in ourselves are almost like a colony. You know, we have more bacterial cells in our body than we do our own cells. Particularly think about our stomach. The way that we digest food is actually primarily through a lot of different bacteria helping us out. But we're still very, very different from something like a coral, right? Because we can't replicate ourselves and then hold hands, right? And then just take over more and more space. But that's essentially what the corals can do. And in fact, different corals, some species of corals actually reproduce by breaking. So like I said, they're able to regenerate. When you're getting a scratch or a cut in the skeleton, they're able to cover that skeleton over. So if you've ever heard of like a staghorn coral or a Cropera cervicornis, which is a really common and important endangered coral in the Caribbean, one of their primary ways of reproducing is actually by breaking off pieces. The waves take them around, and then those fragments or frags are able to heal themselves and then start growing again. So yeah, they're able to recover through just regular wound healing and regeneration and under healthy conditions. Actually, breaking is not necessarily such a problem, which is often why when we think about coral stress, a lot of times people like myself study coral wounding because it's something that's so regular that they have to do anyway and is so impacted by their stress.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And it sounds like maybe some coral species are more open, I guess, to being broken, the more branching style, where maybe the like mounding corals, they don't want
something like this guy is going to have a little bit more trouble because if you think about a chunk of it being taken off, right, it's mounding, so it's going to have a little bit more trouble trying to cover over everything. And it might be even more slow growing than, say, a branching coral. Whereas a branching coral, you know, it can lose a finger, and that finger can go and grow its own, and now you have two of them, and really not much has happened to this other coral.
Wow, yeah. So this one's a little bit different. So have you done any kind of research on like coral behavior, or do you know anything about corals and how they maybe interact with each other?
Yeah, so I have done a little bit of study on coral behavior. So there's two ways of thinking about it. You can think about colonies interacting with each other, and you can think about individual polyps on a colony behaving. And that's the type that I've looked into. So the coral that I did a lot of study on when I was in graduate school is this really interesting species of coral called Ostrangia poculata, or the northern star coral. And what's really interesting about it is that it is what we call a facultative symbiosis. So instead of getting 95% of its energy from its symbionts and needing it in order to eat and to survive, it's kind of okay with it and without it. And so you'll see fully white colonies and fully brown colonies, and colonies where some of the polyps are white and some of the polyps are brown. And they have different strategies in terms of like getting nutrition into their bodies. And one of the things that we were really interested about when we were looking at this coral was, you know, if it can use photosynthesis, and if it can also use heterotrophy, or, you know, consuming other live organisms, you know, how is it able to behave under different circumstances, under different stresses, light conditions, food availability. And so you can actually see the polyps kind of come out when you provide a food stimulus, because they're going to be looking with their tentacles, right, in order to find food. And when they find that food, they're going to pull it back in. Whereas most of the times you see a coral during the daytime, they actually have their tentacles fully contracted because they're just relying on photosynthesis. Whereas at nighttime, that's when they might pull their tentacles out, because it's better time for heterotrophy at that point. If you're thinking about colonies interacting with each other, there is a variety of like aggression between different coral types. So as I mentioned before, there is this constant competition on a coral reef for space. And that's not just between corals and algae and sponges, that's also between corals and corals. So if you have two different species and they grow up and they butt into each other, depending on the species, they might actually use part of their polyp to create these kind of enzyme bombs. They're going to shoot over from one colony to the other one to try and dissolve some of that tissue so that they can take over and start growing over that space. So they do have behavior, even though they kind of just look like plant rocks.
I like that. Plant rocks, see, I've never heard them described that way, but it's almost perfect for what their skeletons look like. So then someone did ask, when you're restoring coral reefs, then it sounds like you need to plant corals somewhat far apart from each other, because otherwise they'll almost start attacking each other for the space.
Again, it really depends on the species, and a lot of times corals of the same species might be kinder to each other than corals of two different species might be. Not all corals are capable of those like enzyme bombs I talked about, and not all of them are going to do it to every single species of coral. There's sort of a hierarchy of ones that have like this strong aggression ability, and ones that are kind of more peaceful, I guess you could say, or just kind of easygoing. So it really depends on the species. But yeah, if you look at a coral garden, and there's a variety of different ways to garden corals, usually, again, depending on the species type, they're going to have them arranged in special ways, either on these, what we call cookies, which are essentially cement little blocks or cookies, and you can put a small fragment in there and they can grow out of there, or sometimes they might be hanging from ropes. But generally you give them a little bit of space. But in a healthy coral reef, especially a really complex one, you're going to see a lot of overlap of different colonies near each other, and they might be close in space to each other.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, meaty. I'm checking out the chat. We've had lots of questions about the space interaction and questions about like kind of reconfirming that they like how they eat. So I kind of wanted to know, so it sounds like they are able to use their symbionts to take advantage of the sun, and produce their own energy, but they're also eating something else in the water. What are they typically eating when they're using chemicals?
Yeah, a variety of different things. Like usually small invertebrates, like little copepods or isopods. So before, when I was talking about how they are cnidarians, like a jellyfish, if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish before, corals are capable of doing a similar thing. So what it means to be a cnidarian means that you have this special cell called a cnidae, or a nematocyst. And in that cell, you're going to have this harpoon. And in the harpoon is loaded a toxin that is specialized for what's in the diet of that organism. So the reason that we feel a sting of jellyfish is because that jellyfish usually eats fish, for instance, and we have similar processes, right? As a fish does as a fellow vertebrate. Whereas you might not, if you touch a coral, you might not feel a sting, because it's more specialized for these small invertebrates. So what happens when a prey stimulus comes by is that the harpoon shoots out of the cell, attaches itself into the prey, and then injects it with a toxin. In some cases, it might paralyze them or sort of reduce their mobility or make them a little sleepy, something like that. And then they're able to sort of pull, with their tentacles, pull that prey into their bodies.
Wow, that's, it honestly makes corals sound like if there was a giant coral that ate fish, maybe that would be scarier.
Yeah, it would be, yeah, jellyfish are very similar. So if you've ever been stung by a jellyfish, now you know what's happened to you.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. And so then we did have a couple questions about that. Like, someone mentioned if you touch a fire coral, you may feel this burning feeling, and like, are there certain corals maybe you should stay away from that could hurt you rather than you just hurting it by accident?
Yeah, so fire corals are a type of coral that do have a lot more of a stinging power than a lot of these other corals do. They're actually of a different group than are these stony corals. So that has a little bit to do with why they're a little more stingy. But yeah, so I personally can tell you that it does not feel great to be stung by a fire coral. But it's generally like a jellyfish sting, depending on where you are in the world. A lot of them are very mild. You can denature or sort of break down that protein by using vinegar or something like that, hot water, to break down that sting. I don't think that there are particularly strong stinging corals. I would say, to give them their space, because they're delicate creatures and they need a little space to be happy. But there are types of jellyfish, particularly in places like Australia, that can have a really strong sting to them that can paralyze or injure, or potentially even, under certain circumstances, kill a human being. There are also, on some coral reefs, especially again in places like Australia, where there are different types of organisms like a blue ring octopus or certain types of snails that live in the reef structure itself, that could also provide you with a bite or a sting that could be toxic for a human. So, that's another reason you might want to give them a little bit of space, because you don't know if these other organisms are there or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we had some questions about, I think it was about the size of the Great Barrier Reef, since you mentioned Australia. Do you have an idea, or, because I'm not too sure?
I don't have a number off the top of my head, but let me look it up. So it looks like it stretches for over 2,300 kilometers. Wow. It takes up an area of 344,000 kilometers. So it is, if you think about the country, the continent of Australia, you think about the size of that, it does take up, visually, you think it does take up a significant portion of what you might consider sort of the land along the side of Australia. Other really big reef systems include the Mesoamerican reef, and that is a long extending barrier reef that's in places like Honduras and Belize and Mexico.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And we did have a question back to the fire corals. Could you, what does a fire coral look like? People are worried about, they want to avoid it. Maybe where—
Oh no, I feel like I've made coral reefs sound so dangerous to you guys.
They're really cool.
Beautiful places. Yeah, so they tend to have a very distinct color to them. They have, I'm trying to see. I do have one. Hold on a sec.
Awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like actually a lot of people are really interested in learning to dive and maybe interacting with these coral reefs, and it's great that y'all are really excited to learn how to identify corals and how to better protect the reefs, because I think we really need to worry about that.
Yeah, I love it. You guys have great questions today. So this is a specimen of a skeleton from one of these fire corals, and this is one that's specifically in the Caribbean. So if you're thinking about the Caribbean, there's a couple of ways to tell it apart. First, it has sort of this more plating in the Caribbean only. This would be differentiating this plating kind of structure. They also tend to have a really distinct color to them. It's like a yellowy orange. It almost kind of looks like it's saying, "Stay away from me." And they also tend to have this white edge around the top of the plates. And that's not necessarily bleaching. It's because different polyps can have different functions on them. So along the tops, they might be a little bit paler in color. But the trick is also, if you are not swimming too close to the corals, if you are wearing the appropriate protection on your body, like a thin wetsuit or something like that, you're going to be okay from them. Yeah, I think your best protection and not getting stung by a fire coral is just good buoyancy and sort of careful practice around corals.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. I'll remember. Hopefully someday a lot of us can go dive and look at these corals in person. That would be great. I think it's awesome you have a lot of the skeletons too.
Yeah, I am a bit of a hoarder, I guess.
That's okay. And so someone did ask, how many, do you know how many types of corals there are? Because it sounds like, just based on morphology, what they look like, there's a lot of variation.
Yeah, so there are in the hundreds of species of different corals.
Wow.
And they have different types of morphology. So you can see like something like, I have more of them, so I can bring them out for you guys. You can have, this is the coral I was telling you about that I studied that actually lives in New England, that temperate coral. So I actually do, like along the east coast of North America, have species of coral. So you can see that is different than something like this, right? Where you have individual polyps here, you have more of a branching morphology, but then in this one, a brain coral, you see that polyps can actually fuse together and their overall shape is more mounding. So there can be a variety of ways in which polyps interact with each other or polyps are structured, and there can also be a variety of ways that the skeletons themselves are built.
Gotcha. Very cool. Do you know, like, so it sounds like each coast is going to have a different variety of species, but someone asked, like, maybe what's America, like maybe there's like a Pacific coast common coral species, if there are any corals out here, or a specific East Coast coral species that's like the most common.
So if you're thinking the Pacific, like California region, you guys are going to have more soft corals, just having to do with the upwelling that you guys have, right? A heavy nutrient load there, cooler waters. The greatest diversity is going to be in the tropics, obviously, because there we have this really clear water where the corals are able to photosynthesize sort of happily, and they're not requiring heterotrophic means in order to feed themselves. In the Caribbean, you're going to have less diversity, like I said, than you're going to have in Indo-Pacific. That's just because there was an explosion of life that happened, you know, when the world started shifting. Like if you guys heard of Pangea, right? You know that the seafloor and continents are not stable. They're constantly moving around, and so that's how you get things like corals in different parts of the world with different types of diversity. So in the Caribbean, for instance, the main building block of a lot of the Caribbean islands that we know and love are those acroporid species, like those staghorn and elkhorn corals I was talking to you about before, which is why there tends to be a lot of emphasis on them for things like restoration, because one, they are endangered, and two, they have been historically very, very important. And then in the Indo-Pacific, you're going to have a wider range of different types of corals that are there. But some of them are going to be similar to the ones that you see in the Caribbean as well.
Wow, yeah, that's cool. So I'm a graduate student also, and my advisor, my professor, also works with corals. So I've heard a lot about corals, and it's been really cool to learn about. Since I didn't know they had little hooks and they could pull in like that, I think it's amazing. We do have a couple more questions about restoration, so I'm going to try to combine a couple of these. So basically, people are asking, how long does it take for coral reefs to generate, and kind of like how do you go about restoring a coral reef? Yeah, I'll leave it to those two.
Sure. When you're thinking about restoration, there are a lot of different components that you have to put into it. Besides, we've been really focusing today on the ecology side, and there's a whole other human component to it. That is in some ways equally as important as thinking about the biology. Thinking about the biology specifically, you know, we have to think about the diversity of life that was there, these functional groups and their importance. Are there keystone species that if we pay attention to those and focus on those, are they going to be capable of sort of helping us, you know, bring back more of what was there? And then, you know, thinking about it from a stress perspective, we also have to think about, you know, what made this reef decline in the first place? Because you can do a lot to say, if you're, okay, we just saw a really rapid decline in live coral cover. And so we're going to put a lot of emphasis back into building back some of that live coral cover. Why was it that that coral died in the first place? And if we just regrow a bunch of corals and put them back out there, is the same thing just going to happen in a couple of years? And so it's a lot more than just like farming some corals and putting them out there. We also have to think about the genetic diversity of each individual species, the genetic diversity of the reef as a whole, because you don't want to take something that was diverse and complex and really rich in structure and then replace it with something that is, you know, sort of this monochrome, singular thing, because it's not going to be as resilient in the face of stress, because it's just, you know, one type of organism now that interacts with the world in one or a few different types of ways, as opposed to if you have this wide diversity within a species itself, and then interspecies as well, because now we're able to potentially interact with the environment in a variety of different ways. So a lot of work in different organizations goes into thinking about genetic diversity, about the genetic structure of a population, thinking about the speed, right, was one of the questions that we can grow corals in. So a lot of these mounding corals are very slow growers, but can be very, very important for the structure of a reef, whereas some branching corals can be really fast growing. And so we might be able to get, you know, larger colonies of those in a shorter period of time, but it doesn't mean that we no longer want these guys around. And there's been a lot of innovation on those. So one example is this thing called micro-fragmentation. So instead of breaking it into small pieces, we break it into super tiny pieces. And for some reason, that really ups and sparks the growth response of the corals, and we're able to get them to grow a lot faster. And I know that I've sort of rambled on for this question for a bit, but I guess my point here is that restoration is something that sounds very simple, right? We lost something, let's put it back. But a lot of times we don't understand why we lost it in the first place. We may have a simple understanding of what that means, but not in actuality, the mechanisms, right, that drove the decline that we saw. And we don't understand all of the diversity of everything that's going on in that environment at the same time. And we're also sort of up against this clock, right, where things are in decline in an area perhaps, and we need to make sure that we're maintaining it so we don't cause a phase shift into a different type of environment. So a lot of times we're sort of actively doing things and actively learning at the same time.
Yeah, so it sounds like that if we're going through the bleaching process, corals can start to recover as long as they are not 100% bleached, like the skeletons that you have, correct?
So yeah, these skeletons that I have are like dead skeletons, and I found these. I do not kill anything in order to take home a skeleton. And also, I know that I'm sort of showing these off. A lot of these I was permitted to take or came from places where it's allowed. So you'll look into the regulations. You don't want to just be taking things from the environment around you. But yeah, the bleaching process and the stress response process is also a complicated thing that can vary a lot depending on the species, because we talked a lot about how there's a bunch of different types of corals. There are also a bunch of different types of symbionts. And not every coral has only one symbiont. A lot of times they have a variety of them at the same time. And each of those symbionts has a different tolerance to temperature. And all of the corals have a different tolerance to temperature. And different corals can take a different variety. Different varieties can live in different corals, and they're all sort of in different places in the world. So that's one of the mechanisms that we might be able to get a little bit more like heat tolerance, for instance, is if we look at places like, say, a very shallow lagoon that is heated up by the sun regularly, right? That might be warmer than a place like a deep part of the reef where the same species live. So we can learn a lot from places where corals are really stressed out, but they're doing okay. And then we can potentially apply those into places where we see a loss of coral and learn from that.
Gotcha. And then I think I can combine a couple of these. So someone's basically asking, if the damage to the Great Barrier Reef continues, how much longer, like if we don't change anything, like what we're doing now, how much longer do you kind of have a guess of maybe how long the coral reef in that area would survive, and what would happen if we had, like, if there was an instant and all coral reefs disappeared, what do you think would happen?
So I don't have an exact number on how long I think coral reefs have, particularly because we can see these really high stress events, and we can also see some events of recovery in between them. So a couple of years ago, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef had this really infamous bleaching event where there was mass mortality, a lot of death of corals along the Great Barrier Reef. And then there are also places in the world where we've seen a lot of really great recovery. And these often tend to be in places sometimes where there was no human intervention. We sort of let nature do its course and it's able to recover on its own. So even finding that line of where intervention is necessary is really important. But a lot of times thinking about restoring corals, one of the back thoughts is that we want to be able to keep species alive, like maintain the genetic diversity that we have for the next 100 to 200 years, because that's when we're going to really start to see a lot of the impacts of the sort of industrial climate change that we're going through now really take its course. So I can't necessarily give you a number on that because I fortunately do not know the future. It would be really great if I did. And if there were no coral reefs in the world, it could be not great, pretty bad for us. So we talked a lot about biodiversity. We talked a lot about different species interacting with reefs in different ways. We also see in general decline in ocean fisheries, right? Because we have this decline in the healthy habitats of the ocean, and we have this increase in really smart technological fishing at the same time. So we have both of those kind of going on at the same time, and even just thinking beyond the life of the coral reef, right? Or even the economics of people being able to go and visit a beautiful place underwater and seeing it, or eating the fish, that grow on there. There's also this other component of geology. So reefs are really important for islands and for shorelines because of the formation of waves. So waves in the ocean travel in circles under the water. And those circles get smaller as you get closer to the seafloor. So if there is something like a reef, right, that's in the way, suddenly the water gets a lot shallower and the energy in those circles of the waves are reduced quite a bit because that energy is dissipated on the barrier itself. And oftentimes when you have a barrier reef, you see this really gentle lagoon where the water is very calm before you hit the shoreline. And this prevents a lot of beach erosion, a lot of destruction of homes and other coastal habitats and things like that. So if you have just all of a sudden no corals, in a lot of parts of the world where the active building of this rock, right, to create this barrier reefs is important, we're going to see a lot more destruction on those shorelines because we no longer have these reef systems anymore.
Wow. Yeah, so it sounds like not only would the marine organisms in the area be impacted, but terrestrial as well, just by the minor fact of that beach erosion, and then things downstream from that.
And human communities as well, and those will primarily be human communities that are underserved, right, that are living in coastlines that maybe they don't have great access to protection, or they don't have great access to the shoreline and things like that. So it would be definitely an issue.
Yeah. So it sounds like we need to keep figuring out how to help restore coral reefs, because they're not only beneficial because there's so many other things outside of that they're really valuable for.
Definitely.
Awesome. I think I'm gonna we still have a ton of questions, so it sounds like, but I'm only gonna be able to do maybe one or two more, and then we'll have our kind of final questions that Skype a Scientist has. But we have had some questions about maybe types of corals. So maybe could you tell us about maybe the biggest coral you've seen, and maybe the rarest type of coral that you've seen?
Ooh. Oh wow. I feel like I really want to have cool answers for you guys, but I don't think I have a cool one on this. The coolest type of coral that I've seen is this cylindric coral that you see in the Caribbean. And they create these huge, really tall mounds, and their tentacles are like really like long and almost singular. And they're more extended kind of continuously than other species of coral are. So when you swim by them, they just look like these lovely, like tall, fluffy carpets. And I like them a lot.
That's awesome. And then I guess, yeah, was this the biggest coral that you've ever seen too?
The biggest coral would probably have to be a mounding coral, probably some species of mounding coral is the biggest I've seen.
Very cool. And it sounds like, I mean, a lot of people, y'all are really interested in corals, and I think that's amazing. It sounds like there's a lot of really cool research out there. And definitely check out, I mean, I bet you there's tons of cool YouTube videos and cool articles about coral reefs, because a lot of people are realizing how important they are, and we need more community members to kind of look into coral reefs and like figure out what we can do better, right? And then I have three, I don't like any kind of last three questions for Liz. Our first one is there anything that you wished we had asked about your work?
That I wish that I had asked. Honestly, we got through some pretty fun and really relevant rabbit holes today, and I got to pull out my rock collection, so I had a good time.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, then it sounds like we did a great job, and we still have, I mean, a bunch of questions just about community ecology and different regions you've been to. So I guess, is there a place that we could direct more coral enthusiasts to?
For sure. For starters, if you are really interested in corals, you don't live near a coral, there's some work that's going on in your local coastline, and even if it's not as like vibrant and cool sounding right now as a coral reef, I guarantee you the second you start diving into all the intricate parts of your local coastline, you're going to be equally as excited. And I guarantee you that there's a ton of local nonprofits and groups that are working on conservation in that area. So wherever you are, I really encourage you into like thinking about your local coastline in the same way you're getting jazzed about corals. And if you're specifically interested in corals, you know, there are a lot of really great documentaries. In fact, I'm sure you all have watched this, but if you haven't yet, the Blue Planet series is really, really great for ocean enthusiasts. Check out your local aquariums. And then I think the other aspect of it, I would say, is to try to start thinking more sustainably, right? So even if you don't live on a coral reef, there are ways through individual actions can protect not only our local coastlines, but coastal habitats like coral reefs.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I have seen some aquariums do live streams of their tanks. So I know I live in California, so I've seen the Monterey Aquarium has done some live streams, which is really cool. So it sounds like even though things are kind of crazy right now, the age of social media has really helped us connect with a lot of people from everywhere. And then I have two more questions. So is there something that you wish everyone knew about your species? So maybe tell us, is there a specific coral you've worked with, or do you kind of work with a broad range? And then what do you want us to know about it?
Yeah, I mean, I have worked a lot with this northern star coral, which is in New England. So that's number one. I think it'd be cool if people knew that actually, yeah, we have corals on the east coast of North America. You know, it's not just something that's limited to the tropics, even though, you know, this is never going to be a full big reef, right? This is probably around the size that these guys grow to. And I think that when we're talking about corals, you know, it's a really good platform to think about the ocean as a whole, because a lot of the things that are stressful for corals specifically are things that are stressful for the ocean. They're just like really good examples that are just ultra sensitive to all of these things. So I think what I wish people would know would be like when I talked about thinking about sustainability, thinking about the impacts of, you know, what we do every day, or the companies that we support, or the politicians that we support if we're old enough to vote, and things like that. So to think more globally and act locally.
Awesome. And yeah, definitely good advice. Everyone can have an impact, so just do some research and figure out what you can do. And the last question is, so this one's really open. Is there something that you wish everyone knew about anything? So any kind of like fun fact that you love to share, or just something cool you really want to tell us today?
Ooh, oh no. Now I have to again to be very cool. Honestly, I know that I just keep repeating it, but I think that something I wish more people knew is that there is a lot that we can do if we're interested in getting involved. there's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of conservation groups and things like that that are doing a ton of great work all around the world, and that it is really possible and really helpful to get involved in those in a variety of ways. Like, you don't have to get out there and scuba dive on a coral reef in order to protect a coral reef. And you can, when I worked at a nonprofit, we had someone who used to do computer work next to me, and she just volunteered to do that. And so everyone has skills. Like, each and every one of you has a lot of skills, and you can use those skills as they exist in ways that can impact the world around you, and can help the environment.
Yeah, I've even seen something as simple as checking the chemicals in your sunscreen can have a really big impact on organisms that live in the reef where you're
I think that does remind me, that is the thing that I wish everyone would know. It is a pet peeve of mine. There is a new sort of fad of calling sunscreens reef safe. And this is because there's been a bunch of studies on particular chemicals like oxybenzone and salactate, I think. And so things that have avobenzone, which is a half-life or like a breakdown of oxybenzone, will call themselves reef safe. But the only reef safe sunscreen that there is to not wear sunscreen. So if you're actually like swimming on a reef, you want to physically cover yourself up. And the next best thing would be a non-nano zinc or titanium oxide sort of physical barrier. So basically what happens is that the sunscreen chemicals that make it so they sink really well into your skin, it works for people fine because, again, we have those different layers of skin, right? We only have that one main interaction with the outside world on our skin, and our tissues tend to be a lot thicker than a coral's. But if you think about a chemical like that having the ability to go into a really thin layer of tissue from both the inside and the outside, suddenly it's really concentrated in there, and then it can cause problems in much, much lower concentrations. So yeah, things like sunscreen. So don't believe it. If it says reef safe on the bottle, you're going to read the ingredients. And that, I think, is just in general really good. It's a good life strategy, is don't believe the labeling, read the background.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think it sounds like that's a great place to end on. I'm really happy everyone had so much fun talking about coral reefs. And thank you so much, Liz, for coming on and chatting with us. And thank you, Erin, for all of the translating. We really appreciate it. And I think that's it for us. So great. Thank you all. And
thanks all for meeting with me, and thanks for having me. I've had a really great time.
Yeah, I love seeing coral skeletons, and it was awesome that you could just pull all these different species out of your collection. Well, great. Well, cool. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.